Hello, people. Not in my normal setup today, so got to go again with the relatively low grade phone stream. Just wanted to do a quick little reaction to Mayor Pete dropping out of the race all of a sudden yesterday. And this reinforces my view that the best nickname for Pete is Sneaky Pete. Not Alfred E. Newman, although that one is very funny, but Sneaky Pete because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for him to drop out at this juncture if you're thinking it from a couple of different standpoints. First, it's a major insult to his voters. Now, I'm not a Pete voter, and I wouldn't have cast my ballot for Pete if I lived in one of the Super Tuesday states. But because of now the widespread adoption of early voting, possibly tens or hundreds of thousands of people, maybe even more nationwide, have already voted for Pete, under the impression that he was at least going to see his campaign through till this next round of elections tomorrow. So if I were a California voter and I had voted for Pete, and then all of a sudden he decides to end his campaign at the last minute, I'd feel a little outraged and resentful, especially if his calculation in dropping out was some kind of vague pundit like prognostication as to what effect his continued candidacy would have on the election outcome tomorrow. That proves that he was never running for principled reasons. Because if he had a principled belief in the utter necessity of his candidacy, then he wouldn't have dropped out on the basis of some kind of far flung delegate calculation that is impossible to confirm with any degree of certainty. Now, anybody who's followed his campaign already should have known that he wasn't running on the basis of any real principled conviction because he shapeshifted over the course of this campaign. He made certain strategic decisions that showed you he was not moored to any particular political philosophy, but rather what was the savviest thing for him to do in any given moment. So, that's why in the fall, he made the choice to position himself as this kind of like moderate unity candidate. And I hate the word moderate, it doesn't accurately capture much of anything. But he wanted to kind of make himself out to be this person that both the progressive, quote unquote, and the moderate, quote unquote, wings could potentially tolerate. But they didn't like, we don't have to go through the whole pundit characterization here. The point is that he wasn't operating from a standpoint of set principle. He was operating just as somebody who thought it would be cool if he were the president and made his decisions according to that sort of framework, rather than a deep set of beliefs that were guiding his campaigning. And that's why you saw him rely so much on these Obama-ish platitudes about how an improbable quest became an undeniable reality or something like that. That's the line that he, I think, debuted after his so-called Iowa win, and he repeated it at his dropout speech last night, where he also claimed once again he won the Iowa caucus, which is, of course, dubious. I'd maybe even give him that win because, who cares at this point? The Iowa caucus is almost irrelevant. I said right away on the night of the caucus that we should regard it as nullified, given how epically it was botched and corrupted. But if he wants to take away from his little adventure that he won the Iowa caucus, so be it. But if you listen to his speech last night, there wasn't anything really about what he wanted to enact as president or what was really the beating heart of his campaign in terms of the policy change that he wanted to bring about. It was more about how his personage would somehow be this healing force and foster a new tone throughout the country. Um, and so it makes perfect sense at the 11th hour, even though he was number 3 still in the delegate count and had the possibility of accumulating some delegates for sure on Super Tuesday, he drops out. In fact, his campaign just a couple days ago put out a very elaborate memo detailing all the places throughout the country on Super Tuesday and beyond where they were saying he could be competitive and accumulate delegates in various districts, etc. And they begged for contributions on that logic. So if you gave money to Pete, because on Wednesday or Thursday of last week, he gave you this playbook that they were saying was going to enable him to become viable in terms of delegate count, you should be extremely offended by this, I would think. Now, it was very curious how this all transpired. Yesterday morning, Pete met with Jimmy Carter at a cafe in Georgia. Or was it Alabama? I believe Georgia. And Jimmy Carter was asked about it afterwards and said something to the effect of, Pete doesn't know what he's going to do after South Carolina. So I'd love to know what was said in that conversation. I'm not suggesting that Jimmy Carter is some kind of grand conspiracy mastermind here, but, a former president can pass along messages and is in pretty routine contact with influential figures in the Democratic Party, even though Jimmy Carter is quite old. He still seems fairly lucid, at least lucid enough where he can have meetings with current presidential candidates. So I'd be very interested to know what was said in that meeting. And then at around 6 o'clock yesterday, the word comes out that Pete's dropping out. He does his dropout speech at 8:30 p.m., which was the same exact time that Mike Bloomberg had bought himself this 3-minute TV address that aired on the major network channels. I believe it aired on CBS and NBC. I actually sat there and watched it because I happened to be in a place where I can sit and watch TV. And so it's interesting that Pete scheduled that for 8:30, the same exact time as Bloomberg's speech or remarks about the coronavirus. And then we hear today, this morning, that shortly after Pete gave his dropout speech, he spoke on the phone to Joe Biden and Barack Obama. So what was said in those conversations? I'd be very interested to know. And why is Pete dropping out while Warren is still around? Pete has more delegates. He arguably won a state. He's placed better than Warren, I believe, everywhere thus far. Correct me if I'm wrong on South Carolina. I don't have that in front of me, but he's done overall better than Warren. And yet Warren's staying in and attacking Bernie, saying Bernie never got anything done over the course of his tenure in Congress. And Warren's running these super PAC ads in very expensive media markets throughout the country. So, is there some grand coordinated conspiracy here to take down Bernie? I would doubt that it's something that was hatched in a smoke filled room and could actually be characterized as a coordinated, active, tangible conspiracy. But there are really conspicuous moves being made that seem entirely undercut simply to undermine Bernie. And then, as I put on the thumbnail of this video, Mike Bloomberg Instagram, after Pete dropped out, put out a photo of them standing together and smiling. It looks like from probably a couple of years ago. It's odd because I had never seen that photo before. I guess it was in the Mike Bloomberg archive someplace. And then he puts it out like that. I mean, I'm not asserting anything definitive about what's happening, but I can tell you that I'm getting a crazy influx of people sending me tweets and DMs and emails, etc., sharing crazy rumors about the machinations that appear to be going on. And, I can't tell you with any certainty what is happening. I mean, we only have another day or so until we find out what happens on Super Tuesday. By the way, I don't like the fact that Super Tuesday, which is a stupid term in the first place, we should call it Stupid Tuesday. But I don't like the fact that this major nationwide day of voting includes both California and Texas, the two biggest states in the country, because it sort of undermines the whole logic behind conducting a presidential primary in sequential order. Because the candidates can't spend the amount of time that you would think it would warrant in California and in Texas. Whereas in a month, when like Wisconsin votes, there's going to be like a full week leading up to Wisconsin. So I just think this front-loaded Super Tuesday is silly, because it's not like, because we're going to have a drawn-out primary anyway. It's going to go on for months. So yeah, that's kind of annoying. I wouldn't assume that Pete's been offered VP. I don't see how Pete would even work as a VP candidate for Biden. I doubt that would happen. And Pete doesn't need to be offered anything necessarily in order for him to capitalize on the publicity and the networks that he's developed over the course of this campaign. So my best guess is that he dropped out purely because he thought it was the most important thing, based on his pundit calculations, to marginally diminish the possibility that Bernie comes away tomorrow with an insurmountable delegate lead. And maybe it works. Look, I mean, the polls right now are not very instructive. Things are very volatile. There are last-minute kind of breaks. Biden is going up somewhat, I would have to think, after South Carolina. And I see no reason to doubt that the win that he got in South Carolina wouldn't translate to other places in the South with similar demographics. Assuming Bernie is going to win California, but the margin is obviously critical there. If it's 15 points, that's huge. If it's 5, that's not so huge. Somewhere in the middle, arguable. So, I think in a way, Texas is probably going to be the most illuminating tomorrow, in terms of the trajectory of the race. But I wouldn't rest on your laurels about Bernie sweeping anything just because he's very likely to do well in California. terms of a narrative, if Biden wins the entire South, if he wins Texas, potentially if he wins Virginia, and then Warren eats into some of Bernie's margins, who knows? So, yeah, that'll do it for now. Hope this phone chat is okay. And we will talk to you later. Or I will. Why am I speaking to the royal we? I don't know.